It was June 13th, 2005, that 12 jurors unanimously acquitted Michael Jackson on various charges of child molestation, conspiracy, and providing alcohol to a minor. It's difficult to know how history will remember the Michael Jackson trial, perhaps as the epitome of Western celebrity obsession, perhaps as a 21st century lynching. Personally, I think it will be remembered as one of the most shameful episodes in journalistic history.
In the last few weeks, a large amount of ugly, malicious information has been released into the media about me. The information is disgusting and false.
It's not until you find yourself digging through newspaper archives and rewatching hours of TV coverage that you truly understand the magnitude of the media's failings. It was industry-wide. No doubt, there were certain reporters and even publications and TV stations that overtly favoured the prosecution. But many of the media's shortcomings were institutional. In a media obsessed with sound bites, how do you reduce 8 hours of testimony into 2 sentences and remain accurate? In an era of rolling news and instant blogging, how do you resist the temptation to dash out of the courtroom at the earliest convenience to break the news of the latest salacious allegations, even if it means missing a slice of the day's testimony? Looking back on the Michael Jackson trial, I see a media out of control. The sheer amount of propaganda, bias, distortion, and disinformation is almost beyond comprehension. Reading the court transcripts and comparing them to the newspaper cuttings, the trial that was relayed to us didn't even resemble the trial that was going on inside the courtroom. The transcripts show an endless parade of seedy prosecution witnesses perjuring themselves on an almost hourly basis and crumbling under cross-examination. The newspaper cuttings and TV news clips detail day after day of heinous accusations and lurid innuendo. It was November 18th, 2003.
Approximately 70 investigators from the Sheriff's Department and the District Attorney's Office served a search warrant at Neverland Ranch in Los Olivos. Additionally, an arrest warrant for Mr. Jackson has been issued on multiple counts of child molestation. The bail amount on the warrant has been set at $3 million.
As soon as the news of the raid broke, news channels abandoned their schedules and switched to 24-hour coverage. When it emerged that Jackson was accused of molesting young cancer survivor Gavin Arvizo, the boy who famously held the singer's hand in Martin Bashir's Living with Michael Jackson documentary, the media went into overdrive. Networks were so obsessed by the Jackson scandal that a terrorist attack in Turkey went almost entirely unreported, with only CNN bothering to broadcast George Bush and Tony Blair's joint press conference about the disaster. All 3 major networks immediately set about producing hour-long specials on the Jackson case, apparently undeterred by the fact that nothing was yet known about the allegations and prosecutors weren't answering questions. CBS dedicated an episode of 48 Hours Investigates to the arrest, while NBC's Dateline and ABC's 2020 also rushed out Jackson specials. Within 2 days of the Neverland raid, and before Jackson had even been arrested, VH1 announced a half-hour documentary called Michael Jackson Sex Scandal. Daily Variety described the Jackson story as a godsend for media outlets, particularly cable news channels and local stations looking to pump up Nielsen numbers in the final week of the all-important November sweeps. Daily Variety was right. Celebrity-oriented news shows saw figures spike when the Jackson story hit. Viewing figures for Access Hollywood were up 10% on the previous week. Entertainment Tonight and Extra both achieved season best audience numbers, and Celebrity Justice also enjoyed an 8% rise. Newspapers reacted just as hysterically as TV stations. "Sicko," shrieked the New York Daily News. "Jacko, now get out of this one," goaded the New York Post. The Sun, Britain's largest newspaper, ran an article titled, "He's bad, he's dangerous, he's history." The piece branded Jackson an ex-black, ex-superstar, a freak, and a twisted individual, and called for his children to be taken into care. If he weren't a pop idol with piles of cash to hide behind, it said, he would have been picked up years ago. Encouraged by the audience boost the Jackson scandal had produced, media outlets made it their mission to milk the case for all they could. Entertainment Weekly's Tom Sinclair wrote, "Media mavens, from the tackiest tabloid reporter to the nattiest network news anchor, are in overdrive scrambling to fill column inches and airtime with Jacko scoops and talking heads." Pressure on news people is enormous, attorney Harlan Braun told Sinclair, so lawyers you've never heard of wind up on television talking about cases they have no connection to. While the media was busy badgering a host of quacks and distant acquaintances for their views on the scandal, the team of prosecutors behind the latest Jackson case were engaged in some highly questionable behaviour, but the media didn't seem to care. During the Neverland raid, District Attorney Tom Sneddon, the prosecutor who unsuccessfully pursued Jackson in 1993, and his officers breached the term of their own search warrant by seizing hordes of irrelevant business papers.
They locked everybody out of the house. They had the whole house to themselves to do whatever they wanted. They went into areas they weren't supposed to go into, like my office. They didn't have search warrants for those places, and they totally took advantage.
They also illegally raided the office of a PI working for Jackson's defence team and lifted defence documents from the home of the singer's personal assistant. Sneddon also appeared to be tampering with fundamental elements of his case whenever evidence came to light which undermined the Arvizo family's claims. For instance, when the DA found out about 2 taped interviews in which the entire Arvizo family sang Jackson's praises and denied any abuse, he introduced the conspiracy charge and claimed that they'd been forced to lie against their will.
And Gavin was the one that asked him, "Could I call you Daddy?" And Michael said, "Of course." And so Star and Davelin calling him Daddy Michael. Very innocent and beautiful relationship.
In a similar instance, Jackson's lawyer Mark Garagos appeared on NBC in January 2004 and announced that the singer had a concrete, ironclad alibi for the dates on the charge sheet. By the time Jackson was rearraigned in April for the conspiracy charge, the molestation dates on the rap sheet had been shifted by almost 2 weeks. Sneddon was later caught seemingly trying to plant fingerprint evidence against Jackson, allowing accuser Gavin Arvizo to handle adult magazines during grand jury hearings, then bagging them up and sending them away for fingerprint analysis. Not only did the majority of the media overlook this flurry of questionable and occasionally illegal activity on the part of the prosecution, it also seemed perfectly content to perpetuate damning propaganda on the prosecution's behalf, despite a complete lack of corroborative evidence. For example, Diane Diamond appeared on Larry King Live days after Jackson's arrest and spoke repeatedly about a stack of love letters the star had supposedly written to Gavin Arvizo. "Does anyone here know of the existence of these letters?" asked King. "Absolutely," Diamond replied. "I do. I absolutely know of their existence." "Diane, have you read them?" "No, I've not read them." Diamond admitted that she'd never even seen the letters, let alone read them, but said she knew about them from high law enforcement sources. But those love letters never materialised. When Diamond said she absolutely knew of their existence, she was basing her comments solely on the words of police sources. At best, the police sources were parroting the Arvizo's allegations in good faith. At worst, they'd concocted the story themselves to sully Jackson's name. Either way, the story went around the world with not a shed of evidence to support it. It was over a year between Jackson's arrest and the beginning of his trial, and the media was forced to try and pad out the story for as long as they could in the interim. Aware that Jackson was bound by a gag order, and therefore powerless to respond, prosecution sympathisers started leaking documents such as Jordan Chandler's 1993 police statement. The media, hungry for scandal and sensationalism, pounced on them. At the same time, allegations sold to tabloid TV shows by disgruntled ex-employees in the 1990s were constantly rehashed and presented as news. Small details of the Arvizo family's allegations would also periodically leak. While most media outlets reported these stories as allegations rather than fact, the sheer amount and frequency of stories connecting Jackson to ugly sexual abuse, coupled with his inability to refute them, had a devastating effect on the star's public image.
I have great faith in our justice system. Please keep an open mind and let me have my day in court. I will be acquitted and vindicated when the truth is told.
The trial began in early 2005 with jury selection. Asked by NBC about prosecution and defence jury selection tactics, Diamond said the difference was that prosecutors would be looking for jurors who had a sense of good versus evil and right versus wrong. No sooner had the jurors been selected that Newsweek was trying to undermine them, claiming that a middle-class jury would be unable to fairly judge a family of lower-class accusers. In an article titled "Playing the Class Card," the magazine said, "The Jackson trial may hinge on something other than race, and we don't mean the evidence." As the trial kicked into gear, it became quickly apparent that the case was full of holes. The prosecution's only evidence was a stack of heterosexual porn magazines and a couple of legal art books. Thomas Mesereau wrote in a court motion, The effort to try Mr. Jackson for having one of the largest private libraries in the world is alarming. Not since the dark day of almost 3/4 of a century ago has anyone witnessed a prosecution which claimed that the possession of books by a well-known artist were evidence of a crime against the state. Gavin Arvizo's brother Starr took the stand early in the trial and claimed to have witnessed 2 specific acts of molestation, but his testimony was completely inconsistent. Regarding one alleged act, he claimed in court that Jackson had been fondling Gavin, but in a previous description of the same incident he told a wildly different story, claiming Jackson had been rubbing his penis against Gavin's buttocks. He also told 2 different stories about the other alleged act on 2 consecutive days in court. During cross-examination, Jackson's lawyer Thomas Mesereau showed the boy a copy of Barely Legal and repeatedly asked if it was the specific edition Jackson had showed him and his brother. The boy insisted that it was, only for Mesereau to reveal that it was published in August 2003, 5 months after the Arvizo family had left Neverland. But this information went almost entirely unreported, the media focusing on the boy's allegations rather than the cross-examination which undermined them. Allegations make good sound bites. Complex cross-examination does not. When Gavin Arvizo took the stand, he claimed that Jackson instigated the first act of molestation by telling him that all boys had to masturbate or else they would turn into rapists. But Mesereau showed under cross-examination that the boy had previously admitted his grandmother made that comment, not Jackson, meaning that the whole molestation story was predicated on a lie. Under cross-examination, the boy severely undermined the prosecution's conspiracy charge by claiming he'd never felt afraid at Neverland and he'd never want to leave. His accounts of the alleged molestation also differed from his brother's. Unfortunately for Jackson, Gavin Arvizo's cross-examination was all but ignored as newspapers giggled and gossiped about what became known as Pajama Day. On the first day of the boy's direct examination, Jackson slipped in his shower, bruising his lung, and was rushed to hospital. When Judge Rodney Melville ordered a breach warrant for Jackson's arrest unless he arrived within an hour, the singer sped to the courthouse in the pajama trousers he'd been wearing when he was rushed to hospital. The photographs of Jackson in his pajamas went all over the world, often with no mention of Jackson's injury or the reason he was wearing them. Many journalists accused Jackson of faking the entire event in order to gain sympathy, although sympathetic is the last word you'd use to describe the media's reaction. The incident didn't stop the media from sending Gavin Arvizo's lurid allegations around the world the following day. Some outlets even ran the boy's testimony as fact, rather than conjecture. He said if boys don't do it, they might turn into rapists. Cancer boy Gavin tells court of Jacko's sex, wrote the Mirror. But the boy's cross-examination was another story. It went almost entirely unreported. Instead of stories about Gavin Arvizo's lies and the 2 brothers' contradictory allegations, newspapers were filled with snarky opinion pieces about Jackson's pajamas, even though Pajama Day had been days previously. Thousands of words were dedicated to whether or not Jackson wore a wig, and The Sun even ran an article attacking Jackson for the accessories he pinned to his waistcoats every day. It seemed like the press would write anything to avoid discussing the boy's cross-examination, which severely undermined the prosecution's case. This habit of reporting lurid allegations but ignoring the cross-examination which discredited them became a distinct trend throughout Jackson's trial. In an April 2005 interview with Matt Drudge, Fox columnist Roger Friedman explained, "What's not reported is the cross-examination of these witnesses is usually fatal to them." He added that whenever anybody said anything salacious or dramatic about Jackson, the media went running outside to report on it and missed the subsequent cross-examination. Drudge agreed, adding, "You're not hearing how witness after witness is disintegrating on the stand. There is not one witness, at least lately, that hasn't admitted to perjuring themselves in previous proceedings, either in this case or in some other case." This alarming trend of ignoring cross-examination was perhaps most apparent in the media's coverage of Kiki Fournier's testimony. Under direct examination by the prosecution, Fournier, a Neverland housekeeper, testified that when at Neverland, children often became unruly, and she had sometimes seen children so hyperactive that they could, feasibly, have been intoxicated. The media scurried outside to report this apparent bombshell and missed one of the most significant pieces of testimony in the entire trial. Under cross-examination by Thomas Mesereau, Fournier said that during the Arvizo family's final weeks at Neverland, the period which the molestation supposedly happened, the 2 boys' guest rooms had been constantly messy, leading her to believe that they had been sleeping in their own quarters all along, not Michael Jackson's bedroom. She also testified that Starr Arvizo had once pulled a knife on her in the kitchen. explaining that she did not feel it had been intended as a joke and that she thought he'd been trying to assert some sort of authority. In a devastating blow to the prosecution's increasingly hilarious conspiracy charge, Fournier laughed at the idea that anybody could be held prisoner at Neverland Ranch, telling the jurors that there was no high fence around the property and the family could have walked out at any time with ease. When Gavin and Starr's mother, Janet Arvizo, took the stand, Tom Sneddon was seen with his head in his hands. She claimed that a videotape of herself and her children praising Jackson had been scripted word for word by a German man who barely spoke English. In outtakes, she was seen singing Jackson's praises and looking embarrassed and asking if she was being recorded.
Oh, we're on camera?
Yeah.
Oh.
We are?
Yeah, I said rolling.
Oh, God!
She said that had been scripted too. She claimed she'd been held hostage at Neverland, even though logbooks and receipts showed she'd left the ranch and returned on 3 occasions during the period of, quote, captivity. It became apparent she was currently under investigation for welfare fraud.
Even the prosecutor said she may have committed perjury in certain of her applications.
And had also been falsely obtaining money on the back of her son's illness, holding benefits to pay for his cancer treatments when he was already covered by insurance. Even the most ardent of prosecution supporters had to admit that Janet Arvizo was a disastrous witness for the state, except Diane Diamond, who in March 2005 seemed to use Janet Arvizo's welfare fraud, which she was convicted of in the wake of Jackson's trial, as roundabout proof of Jackson's guilt, singing off a New York Post article with the gobsmacking line, "Pedophiles don't target kids with Aussie and Harriet parents." Watching their case crumble before their eyes, the prosecution applied to the judge for permission to admit evidence of prior bad acts. Permission was granted. Prosecutors told the jury they would hear evidence of 5 former victims. But those 5 former cases turned out to be even more laughable than the Arvizo's claims.
And the judge did something I've never seen happen in a case like this. With respect to 3 of those alleged 5 victims, they put on 3 guards who had worked at Neverland to say they saw these 3 people molested. And the 3 people they say they saw molested, they were my first 3 witnesses. They came in and said they were never touched.
Roger Friedman complained in an interview with Matt Drudge. When Thursday started, that first hour was this guy Ralph Cocone, who had worked at the ranch as a security guard. He told the most outrageous story. It was so graphic, and of course everybody went running outside to report on it. But there were 10 minutes right before the first break on Thursday when Tom Mesereau got up and cross-examined this guy and obliterated him. The 4th so-called victim, Jason Francia, took the stand and claimed that when he was a child, Jackson had tickled him 3 times outside his clothes and he needed years of therapy to get over it. The jury was seen rolling their eyes, but reporters, including Dan Abrams, heralded him as compelling, predicting that he could be the witness who put Jackson behind bars. The 5th alleged victim was Jordan Chandler, who fled the country rather than testify against his former friend.
He's the one who got a settlement in the early 90s. Now, my understanding is the prosecutors tried to get him to show up, and he wouldn't. If he had, I had witnesses who were going to come in and say he told them it never happened, and that he would never talk to his parents again for what they made him say, and it turned out he had gone into court and gotten legal emancipation from his parents.
June Chandler, Geordie's mother, testified that she hadn't spoken to her son in 11 years. Questioned about the 1993 case, she seemed to suffer from a severe case of selective memory. At one point she claimed she couldn't remember being sued by Michael Jackson, and at another said she'd never even heard of her own attorney. She also never witnessed any molestation.
So when that happens, I think we were able to effectively take all this and say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you can't believe these prosecutors. You can't believe their case. You know, they'll say anything to try and win.
When the prosecution rested, the media seemed to lose interest in the trial. The defence case was given comparatively little newspaper space and airtime. The Hollywood Reporter, which had been diligently reporting on the Jackson trial, missed out 2 whole weeks of the defence case. The attitude seemed to be that unless the testimony was graphic and salacious, unless it made a good soundbite, it wasn't worth reporting. The defence called numerous fantastic witnesses, boys and girls who had stayed with Jackson time and again and never witnessed any inappropriate behaviour, employees who had witnessed the Arvizo boys helping themselves to alcohol in Jackson's absence, and celebrities who had also been targeted for handouts by the accuser. But little of this testimony was relayed to the public. When District Attorney Tom Sneddon referred to black comic Chris Tucker as boy during his cross-examination, the media didn't bat an eyelid. When both sides rested, the jurors were told that if they found reasonable doubt, they had to acquit. Anybody who had been paying attention to the proceedings could see that the doubt was so far beyond reasonable it wasn't even funny. Almost every single prosecution witness either perjured themselves or wound up helping the defence. There wasn't a shed of evidence connecting Jackson to any crime, and there wasn't a single credible witness connecting him to a crime either. But that didn't stop journalists and pundits from predicting guilty verdicts. CNN's Nancy Grace leading the way.
And I will eat crow if they don't get this guy on something.
Defence attorney Robert Shapiro, who had once represented the Chandler family, stated with certainty on CNN, he's going to be convicted. The hysteria of the fans outside the courthouse was mirrored by that of the reporters who secured seats inside, who were so excitable that Judge Rodney Melville ordered them to restrain themselves.
The media worldwide were out to get Michael Jackson. The kind of copy that his being convicted, remanded to jail, the build-up to a sentencing, which would have been the biggest sentencing in world history, was something they wanted. You know, this was big, big business. They were doing everything they could to spin a conviction.
When the jury delivered 14 not guilty verdicts, the media was humiliated, Mesereau said in a subsequent interview.
We, the jury, in the above entitled case, find the defendant not guilty of a lewd act upon a minor child.
Media analyst Tim Rutten later commented, so what happened when Jackson was acquitted on all counts? Red faces? Second thoughts? A little soul-searching, perhaps? Maybe one expression of regret for the rush to judgment? In a post-verdict news conference, Sneddon continued to refer to Gavin Arvizo as a victim and said he suspected the celebrity factor had impeded the jury's judgment, a line many media pundits swiftly appropriated as they set about undermining the jurors and their verdicts. Within minutes of the announcement, Nancy Grace appeared on Court TV to allege that the jurors had been seduced by Jackson's fame and bizarrely claimed that the prosecution's only weak link had been Janet Arvizo. She said, "But you know what? I'm also not surprised. I thought that celebrity is such a big factor. When you think you know somebody, when you've watched their concerts, listened to their records, read their lyrics, believed they were coming from somebody's heart, Jackson is very charismatic. Although he never took the stand, that had an effect on this jury." Over on Fox News, Wendy Murphy labelled Jackson the Teflon molester and said that jurors needed IQ tests. She later added, "They basically put targets on the back of all, especially highly vulnerable kids that will now come into Michael Jackson's life." Legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin told CNN that he thought the prior bad acts testimony had been effective evidence, even though various boys at the heart of the testimony had taken the stand as defence witnesses and denied ever being molested. Only Robert Shapiro was dignified in the face of the verdicts, telling viewers that they should accept the jurors' decision because the jurors were from a very conservative part of California, and if they had no doubt, none of us should have any doubt. The following day on Good Morning America, Diane Sawyer upheld the notion that the verdict had been influenced by Jackson's celebrity status. "Are you sure?" she pleaded. "Are you sure this gigantically renowned guy walking into the room had no influence at all?" The Washington Post commented, "An acquittal doesn't clear his name, it only muddies the water." Both the New York Post and New York Daily News ran with the snide headline, "Boy oh boy." In her final New York Post article about the trial, Diane Diamond bemoaned the not guilty verdict, saying that it left Michael Jackson untouchable. She wrote, "He walked out of court a free man, not guilty on all counts. But Michael Jackson is so much more than free. He now has carte blanche to live out his life any way he wants, with whomever he wants, because who would ever try and prosecute Michael Jackson now?" In Britain's Sun newspaper, celebrity rent-a-gob and talking head extraordinaire Jane Moore penned an article titled, "If the jury agree Janet Arvizo is a bad mum, and she is, how did they let Jackson off?" It began, "Michael Jackson is innocent. Justice has been done." Or so the Looney Tunes gathered outside the courthouse would have us believe. She went on to question the jurors' mental capacity and dismiss the American legal system as half-baked. "Nothing and no one truly emerges as a winner from this sorry mess," she finished. "Least of all what they laughably call American justice." After the initial outrage, the Michael Jackson story slipped out of the headlines. There was little analysis on the not guilty verdicts and how they were reached.
The money was in a conviction.
The story was over. There were no apologies and no retractions. There was no scrutiny, no inquiries or investigations. Nobody was held to account for what was done to Michael Jackson. The media was content to let people go on believing their heavily skewed and borderline fictitious account of the trial. When Michael Jackson died, the media went into overdrive again. What drugs had killed him? How long had he been using them? Who had prescribed them? What else was in his system? How much did he weigh? But there was one question nobody seemed to ask. Why? Why was Michael Jackson so stressed and so paranoid that he couldn't even get a decent night's sleep unless somebody stuck a tube full of anaesthetic in his arm? I think the answer can be found in the results of various polls conducted in the wake of Michael Jackson's trial. A poll conducted by Gallup in the hours after the verdict showed that 54% of white Americans and 48% of the overall population disagreed with the jury's decision of not guilty. The poll also found that 62% of people felt that Jackson's celebrity status was instrumental in the verdicts. 34% said they were saddened by the verdict, and 24% said they were outraged. In a Fox News poll, 37% of voters said the verdict was wrong, while an additional 25% said celebrities buy justice. A poll by People Weekly found that a staggering 88% of readers disagreed with the jury's decision. The media did a number on its audience, and it did a number on Jackson. After battling his way through an exhausting and horrifying trial, riddled with heinous accusations and character assassinations, Michael Jackson should have felt vindicated when the jury delivered 14 unanimous not guilty verdicts. But the media's irresponsible coverage of the trial made it impossible for Jackson to ever feel truly vindicated. The legal system may have declared him innocent, but the public, on the whole, still thought otherwise. Allegations which were disproven in court went unchallenged in the press. Shaky testimony was presented as fact. The defence's case was all but ignored. When asked about those who doubted the verdicts, the jury replied, "They didn't see what we saw." They're right. We didn't. But we should have done. And those who refuse to tell us remain in their jobs unchecked, unpunished, and free to do exactly the same to anybody they desire. Now that's what I call injustice.